So what I decided to do, I wanted to come and visit the Quello Centre, but I realised that I looked at the things that I work on and what I thought would be, most likely to generate interest and connect with people's work here. And so I thought about the recent work that I've done for the World Bank World Development Report, and I saw, Bill, you also wrote some background papers, and
Yes.
colleagues, so I'm sure other colleagues here have been involved in this. So this was something that in some ways fell into my lap, which was a really nice thing to happen. So I worked at the World Bank in the 1990s, before I moved into this current area of sort of network science, web science. I worked for a couple of years in the policy research department, doing work on poverty analysis within countries, in particular in the former Soviet Union. And so that work, because I moved into this new area of research in around the 2002 through 2003, I sort of lost contact with the World Bank. I was doing sort of consulting work for them up until then, but then I was there a couple of years ago, and I was visiting some former colleagues, and they were asking me about what I do, and I said I work on the social science of the internet, and they said, well, do you know that the next World Development Report is going to be on the internet for development? Would you like to contribute something to it? And so it was kind of, I guess, networks really. That's what led to me writing this background paper. And so we agreed that I would write something on the development impact, basically something on development and social media. And that was sort of the terms of reference, and we went back and forward on what the the exact nature of the report would be, and what I'm going to do in the presentation today is just take you through the report or key aspects of the background paper. So this is published, and I've got the cover there. But the thing that we're doing, and so I wrote it with Kiyosaka Tanaka, who at the time was a master's student at the ANU, and so he's the co-author of the paper. He's now a PhD student in communication at Northwestern. So I'll be seeing him again next week, I believe. But anyway, so it's a joint paper with Kiyosaka, and what we. And so I'm just going to, so the paper is published, but I'm planning to revise it and submit it to a journal. And so it's very much sort of current work in that sense. So any feedback or suggestions or critiques would be very much appreciated. So how can we assess the impact of social media on social and economic development? So this is a sort of a graphic that in some ways captures what we're trying to do with this, where on the left hand side we've got sort of a stereotypical sort of social media network with these different brand names there. We've got Facebook and Twitter and various other social media sites, and then on the right hand side we've got an image that tries to capture the idea of, I guess, political change, and then below it's innovation. That's what it's trying to represent, innovation and economic development. And we tried to cover both of those aspects in this paper, and I think it's a really big ask to be able to cover both successfully. And so I think we probably we treated it in some ways, in some areas, as a bit more shallow than we probably could have, but that's what we're trying to cover. And the other aspect about this paper is that I wanted to have a very explicit social networks kind of angle to the paper. And that reflects the sort of the approach to studying the web that I follow, is that I'm primarily interested in the web as a source of data for understanding networks, for constructing and analysing social and organisational networks. So I take a sort of a social network analysis perspective to my work, and so I wanted to make sure that was a strong feature of this paper. Otherwise, I'd be sort of moving in, basically, so I could be sort of working to my strengths, which is, I guess, an SNA framework. So the starting point was that social media is enabling people to connect with one another more easily than in the past. It allows people to form networks, and networks have an impact on people's behaviour and outcomes. And so the question is, how can we tie social media, social networks and development all together? And so I took two approaches in this. I keep saying I, but this was Kiosaka and myself. It's joint work, but I'm kind of just in the moment using my talking about myself. But we took two approaches. So the first approach was. The other thing was that I knew that the people who were running the World Development Report were economists, and they had a broader vision than, it wasn't meant to be just an economics report, it was meant to be broader than that. But they had, one of the reasons why they were interested in hiring me to be involved in this was because I was an economist, I'd done some work for the World Bank in the past, and also I studied the internet. So I thought, well, I'm going to, bring the economics to the fore where possible in this paper. And so the starting point was I was interested in the economics literature on social learning, because that is connected to social networks, and I thought that might be a way to understand how social media could impact on development via a social learning sort of framework. And so part of the paper reviews how economists tackle the topic of social learning. And so I'll quickly go through that and then move on to the next part. So economists distinguish between two types of social learning: observational learning and communication learning. Observational learning is where agents have a certain view of the world or a belief about the state of the world. And the state of the world might refer to what is a good restaurant in town. I've just come into town and I'd like to know where's a good place to eat. And they might have their own beliefs based on what they know about various restaurants. But what people do is they update their beliefs about the state of the world by observing how other people act. That's what observational learning is. And so, for example, if you see a queue of people outside of a restaurant, or a lot of people are in a restaurant, that might lead you to update your belief about what is a good restaurant and what's not a good restaurant. And so there's a lot of economics research on this area, and it leads to all sorts of interesting phenomena such as herd behaviour. So that's where people follow. They don't follow their private signals. They just they throw their private signal out the window, and then they just follow what everyone else is doing, and that can lead to suboptimal outcomes. And then the economists have an interesting term where they say that a society is known to be wise if in the long if the consensus opinion, so what people think on average, is the correct opinion, is the correct state of the world. And so I thought, well, how does social media impact on observational learning potentially? And so that made me think about online rating and online ratings and recommendation systems. So this is what they're doing, is allowing people to know how other people are consuming. So when you're on Amazon and you've bought a book, Amazon will let you know people who read this book also read these other books. And so these are recommendation systems, and there are rating systems, and these are likely to be having an impact on observational learning. It's influencing how we understand what other people are doing and what is good in terms of products or books. And so these are just questions that I've got on the slide here. I don't have any answers to this, but do online recommendation systems impact on the likelihood that societies will be wise in the long term, in the sense that there will be consensus, and that consensus will be correct? Do these systems sort of provide incentives for selfish behaviour or falsification, in the sense that there's astroturfing where people use social media to sort of promote a product or make it seem that it's much more popular than what it actually is. So I thought that was relevant to observational learning. The second thing that economists are interested in the area of social learning is known as communication learning, and that is where agents are updating their beliefs about the state of the world, but it's not via observing what everyone else is doing. It's actually by receiving signals that other people relay to them through social networks. So via your friends, you hear about what is a good product or a good restaurant, and so it's basically it's related to this idea of social influence, where people are, through social networks, are influencing one another in terms of their preferences towards goods and services. And so again, I thought this could be an interesting angle into understanding how social media can impact on economic outcomes. And so there's a couple of other dot points there that once again, this is a very large area of literature. Researchers have looked at, for example, Golub and Jackson have looked at how different network configurations, what are the implications of different network configurations for communication learning. And they found that what's known as asymptotic learning, and that means that as the network grows, you can get consensus or a wise society appearing. And they found that under various different theoretical network structures, you can get wisdom in the long term as the network grows. But they've also shown, they've done work looking at how as networks grow, if particular actors within the network become if the influence of particular individuals within the network does not decline to the point of vanishing as the network grows to a large scale, then they find that you will not get a wise society in the limit. So as networks grow, if some actors become more prominent or influential in the sense that people trust their views about the state of the world, then under those circumstances, this theoretical economics research has found that you can get a society that's not wise in the sense that you can get consensus about the state of the world being incorrect. And I thought that that was an interesting thing because it relates to this, there's a lot of interest in the idea of large-scale networks being constructed along a power law, in the sense that certain actors have a lot more of attention or influence within the network than other actors. And so I thought that this was a way of connecting the research on power laws, I guess, to communication learning. And so how does social media impact on communication learning? Well, once again, I think it's quite apparent that social networking sites such as Facebook and also microblogs such as Twitter facilitate communication learning. I have recently, for someone who studies Twitter, I guess it's slightly embarrassing to admit that I've only just recently started using Twitter, and I'm learning a lot of things about what colleagues think about is interesting, and what areas of research are interesting, or what trends in politics and society are interesting. And so I'm picking up on these signals via tracking what people are saying via this, via Twitter, which I guess is a social network of sorts. And so again, I've got some questions on this slide about how social media might impact on communication learning. Does it impact on the likelihood that society will be wise? Using this economics terminology. Does it increase the likelihood of selfish behaviour? Where people are actually in some ways trying to mislead other people via social networks. And also I'm interested in this idea that that social networks might impact on the prevalence or the likelihood of people having I guess more influence or visibility than other people, because what we found is that, or what's been suggested is that in growing networks there is this rich get richer phenomenon, and I've experienced that firsthand actually, just with Twitter. I'm a latecomer to Twitter, and I have a very paltry number of followers. And what was the first thing I did when I went on Twitter? I started following well-known people on Twitter. So I started linking to the already existing superstars or prominent people on Twitter, and I guess I won't go into the psychology of why, or the strategy of why I did it, but in some ways it's a way for me to help identify who I am is by who I'm following on Twitter. But also there might be a sort of a feeling that, oh well, if I follow them, they might follow me back, and then I'll have a superstar Twitter person following me. Thanks for following me, Bill, by the way. I should mention. Anyway, so social media can influence the likelihood of people, it's a potentially a reconfiguring technology, and that could have an impact on communication learning, in the sense that certain people become very prominent and have a lot of influence over how other people think. Okay, so that was the first kind of part of the paper, and it was really, I guess, an attempt to really connect in with the economics literature. I have to say, I don't, we didn't get so far as I was hoping. We sort of just basically kind of sketched out a few ideas and put some questions in, such as what I've been going through now. The second part of the paper is where, rather than, what we did in the second part of the paper was try to connect directly with the economic and social development literature and see examples of that literature where social networks featured prominently, and therefore try to draw some conclusions about how social media as an enabler of social networks might then have impacts on social and economic development. And so this is another body of literature that we then therefore sort of started getting into. Firstly, economic development. There were two aspects of economic development that we thought was relevant to our paper. Firstly, technology adoption. So that's the idea that households or individuals learn about new technologies and practices that can be productivity enhancing, such as new ways of farming, or the importance of educating your children. And so what we looked for were examples of research where there was an explicit social networks dimension or aspect to the research on technology adoption. And so there was a couple of papers that we found, I'm sure there's more out there, but Dufflo et al. Looked at the adoption of fertiliser in Kenya, and they had a very explicit social networks, social learning sort of framework to that research. There's another paper by Kramer and Miguel where, again, they were looking at the use of deworming drugs in Kenya. So this is, I guess, for cattle or for livestock. And they were looking at the diffusion of this technical innovation and to what extent social networks were constraining or enabling the diffusion of that technology. So that seemed to be a pretty obvious angle for us to take. And then the second one in regards to economic development was aspirational change. And this is something that I had not encountered before. And this came out of some of the World Bank literature that we located. But it's the idea that households become more future-oriented. And the other term that's been used is that the aspirational window is opened. And that leads to the households, going through a different pathway in terms of education and also investing in productive capacity. So it's this idea that the sort of the attitude or the orientation of the actor or the household gets changed. And so a paper by Makurs and Varkas found evidence. They conducted a controlled experiment where they were matching up people within a village with leaders, village leaders in a certain way, or mentors, and they wanted to see what was the impact of this matching on the future orientation or aspirations of the household. Was there a sort of a change in their attitudes and their beliefs about how they should be their investments in education and other productive capacity? So that seemed, again, like an interesting sort of angle of research. And then political development, social and political development. Again, we were interested to know what work had been done on social networks and if it was available, work on social media and how, in the context of people's attitudes towards social and political change. And this actually was much easier to find examples of internet-related research. It was not that hard. Okay, so that was kind of for this second part of the paper. This was what the two angles we were taking. And so, what's the social media context to this? Well, as I said in my introduction, I guess I study social media from a social networks perspective. I look at it as a social media as a way for people to form social networks, maintain social networks, and therefore we can use social media. Well, therefore we can understand the impact of social media on people's outcomes and behaviour via a social network framework. And so, what is the social network framework that we need to, that we're looking at here? Well, it's this literature on weak ties and strong ties, and also sort of related literature on structural wholes. So the idea of, again, this is a very well-developed body of literature in social networks research, but the sort of the very brief idea behind it is that a weak tie is a connection that you have with someone where it's not an intense connection. You don't know that person very well. You don't have many friends in common, and that's known as a weak tie. And Mark Granovetter has done, developed this sort of body of research. And what he showed is that weak ties can have strength in the sense that weak ties are how you find novel information that people that you know well don't have, and this can allow you to innovate. It might allow you to find a new job, or to find an area that you could be, or a set of skills, or a set of techniques or technologies that can be useful to the work that you're doing. And weak ties are a source of innovative information that's relevant to innovation. In contrast, strong ties are connections with people where you have an intense connection, so you know them well, you have a lot of communication with them. Typically you have a lot of people in common. So these might be connections with your family and connections with your old friends, where you have lots of friends in common. So we thought that those distinctions, the distinction between strong ties and weak ties, would be relevant to this. And the related concept of structural wholes. So this is the work of Ronald Burt. So this is the idea that opportunity structures lead to gaps in the structure of communication. And I know I'm in a school of communication, so this will be very familiar to you. But it's the idea that there can be gaps or holes in communication, in the sense that there are groups who do not connect with one another, who perhaps should be connected to one another, and they're not communicating directly with one another. And what Ronald Burt has found is that there is strategic advantage for those or people who occupy those structural holes, in the sense that they connect to groups who are otherwise not connected within an organisation, for example. And that's the setting for a lot of his research, has been organisational settings. He's also looked at the strategic advantage associated with not bridging a structural hole, i.e. that there is advantage to being in a tightly embedded network, in the sense that you then there can be trust and monitoring, low monitoring costs, and that can lead to sort of efficiency and productive gains as well. But so that literature seemed to be relevant to what we were trying to do in this part of the paper, because microblogs are often considered as being, so this is Twitter as the prime example, they're often considered to be platforms for developing weak ties. If I look at my Twitter feed, and I'm now kind of constantly looking at it, unfortunately, most of the people on that feed are weak ties. I mean, I don't know them in the real world. I don't have strong connections. Some of them I do know in the real world and know them quite well, like Bill, for example. But most of them I've never met. So I'd have to consider them to be weak ties. Social networking sites such as Facebook that Facebook is considered as a tool that's more known or more used for formation and maintenance of strong ties. I think these there are these are very general statements, and some people some people would argue that social media in general is about weak ties, not strong ties. But research has shown that on Facebook, people are typically friends with people that they know in the real world. A lot of their friends are people that they know in the real world. And, so I would say it's more of a technology for strong tie formation and maintenance. So the question then is, how can we relate this research on social networks and social media to these two topics of technology adoption, three topics: technology adoption, aspirational change, and also political change or social change. Well, I think the story regarding technology adoption is quite straightforward. It's as I mentioned before, weak ties are known as a source of innovative information, or information relevant to innovation. So I think that in some ways the technology adoption is likely to come through weak ties. However, that argument might be more relevant in a developed economy setting, in the sense that in a developed economy you've got very strong sort of market forces, and there are people who are desperately trying to innovate, because by innovating, and that allows them to gain a market advantage and therefore make lots of money. So there's kind of this strong demand and need for innovation, and I think that's where the weak tie argument kind of makes sense, and that's where this weak tie argument in the context of strategic advantage, it's all within a developed country setting. That's where the theory and the research has been done. So the question is, does that translate well to a developing country setting? And I suspect, and what we argue in the paper, is that it's not so clear that it does translate, because in a developing country setting, you've often, what the technology adoption is not about entrepreneurs necessarily trying to innovate. It's more about, although that of course is happening in developing countries, but in this context of development, it's more about getting households and farmers to use currently known approaches that are better than what they're already doing. And so in my earlier slides I mentioned the example of fertilisers in Kenya and deworming drugs also in Kenya. So these were not entrepreneurs coming up with new fertiliser or new new ways of keeping your livestock healthy, but it was more about how to diffuse this innovation amongst the farmers in order to make things better for them on average. So it's possibly the weak tie argument is less relevant in this context, I think. And the reason is because there's only mixed evidence that social learning can contribute to technology adoption in developing country settings. So the paper by Dufflo et al., they found no evidence that social learning, so this is what, learning about best practices via your social networks, they found no evidence that social learning contributed to the adoption of fertiliser in Kenya, despite its demonstrated profitability. And so what that suggests to me is that technology adoption in a developing country setting, it's going to be more about strong ties, in the sense that people are learning about new practices via someone that they know very well, someone that they trust and someone that they can relate to, and that therefore leads them to adopt a new and innovative practice. So it's really ties that are a source of trust are going to be more important in order for this transmission of new information. So what about economic aspirational change? So that's the idea that the households' aspirational window is widened. Well, once again, I think it can be argued that it's more about strong ties than weak ties. And so the research by Ray from 2006, they found that individuals form their aspirations or change their aspirations by observing other individuals with whom he or she can identify. So these people are likely to be close, they're going to be a source of trust, or they're going to be someone that people trust, and so aspirational change is more likely to come via strong ties than weak ties. So what's the social media context for the above? Well, our conclusion is that in a developing country setting, economic or technology adoption and also aspirational change is more likely to come via strong ties than weak ties. So we're arguing that there's a potential role of social networking sites such as Facebook, because they are a source of strong ties, but it's not really clear that there will be a development impact of social networking sites such as Facebook, and I refer to them as social networking sites in the wild, because of this issue of just the infrastructure and the digital the digital divide. Basically, the households that need this information and this support and in order to change their practices they're not likely to be on Facebook, and so it's probably not going to, to be an immediate source of help. But what we argue is that maybe social networking sites in the future could be used as a platform for connecting people together in a sort of a controlled way, in the sense that, in the same way that the study has looked at connecting mentors and with other people, maybe that can be done via social networking sites, and therefore this mentoring relationship could be supported over time via distance, via social media. Okay. What about political change? Well, so sort of the pre-internet or the pre-social media literature, we looked for examples where people have looked at social networks and political change, and one example is the work by Gibson. Gibson argues that weak ties are effective in transmitting novel information about unfamiliar political institutions, for example, democracy within a country that doesn't have democracy. But they may also transmit information which undermine democratic governance. And what Gibson argues is that in societies where democratic values and processes are not well understood, so for example transitional regimes, weak ties can contribute to social learning in this context, and can have a positive impact. But in countries where political institutions and democratic values are strong, maybe weak ties will not be as important. So that was the sort of an example of literature that we found that's sort of pre-social media literature. When it came to looking at social media and political change, we found there's lots of research on this area. So for example, Howard and others have looked at the role of social media, in particular Twitter, and how it contributed to the democratic democratic progress during the so-called Arab Springs. But this is contested. Malcolm Gladwell, for example, has been very prominent in arguing that social media did not contribute to the Arab Springs. That he argues that political change, such as what occurred there, requires people to take to engage in risk-taking behaviour, i.e. going out into the streets, where you could end up being locked up or worse. And so he argues that it's actually strong ties that are important in order to help people to decide to engage in actions that are designed to change the political situation. And so his comment, or the quote, is that the revolution will not be tweeted. So I would say that the research consensus, there possibly isn't a consensus on this in terms of what the impact of social media was on during the Arab Springs, and also the Occupy Wall Street movement, for example. Okay, so basically finding a conclusive relationship between social media and development is difficult. This is I'm moving into the summary part of the talk. So we actually found this a really challenging paper to write. It was intellectually very interesting, and it was a good thing for us to get involved in, but it was actually challenging to come up with a straightforward story, and that's what the World Development Report people wanted. They wanted, and so we kept on getting feedback coming back. It was like, the paper was too academic, and there weren't enough boxes, kind of. So we ended up putting in more boxes and things. But this is being filmed, I know. But anyway, hello, World Bank people. But in the end, it was a challenging paper, but rewarding for us. I hope the World Bank people found it useful. It made its way, had a bit of an impact in the main report. But it was challenging because a lot of the research is on developed countries, and a lot of the research is contested. So you've got two challenges there. Number one, there's the research is contested. Number two, it's in developed country settings, and therefore, how do you translate it to a developing country setting? It's very difficult to find a network effect more generally. If this is a story about networks impacting on people's behaviours and outcomes, finding a network effect is a really challenging thing because of issues of heterogeneous, unobserved heterogeneity. So people, the people who use social media well may also have these unobserved attributes that make them more likely to succeed anyway. And so therefore finding a causative effect of social media is challenging, or networks in general. Anyway, but we also found it was difficult to come up with straightforward conclusions, because there's a very strong country-specific factors that are going to be playing out here that make it very difficult to come up with a general statement. And I'm not saying that the World Bank was pushing us to come up with a general statement, but in some ways I felt that was what I wanted to do, was to have a sort of a big kind of policy kind of type conclusions and overview, and that was challenging. So I just want to finish up with talking about these three aspects of, or three country-specific factors that make it challenging to draw a strong conclusion about the impact of social media and on development. Firstly, as I've already alluded to, there's this issue of the overall level of development of the country. You know, how the internet, or more generally, or social media more specifically, impacts on a country's economic and social development is largely going to be dependent on the telecommunications infrastructure. You know, so what's the percentage and distribution of the population with internet access? How much is mobile phone being used? Also the education level of the population, and you know, the level of digital literacy. These are going to be crucial in terms of our understanding about how the internet can impact on development outcomes. And I just wanted to take a quick side tour and talk about the Web Foundation's Web Index, which is something that I was involved in as a member of the Science Council. So it's a multi-dimensional measure of the web's utility and impact on people and nations, and it attempts to provide a sort of a ranking of countries similar to the United Nations Human Development Index, ranking countries on the basis of how the web is contributing to social, political and economic outcomes. And what they do in this index is they explicitly try to capture the importance of infrastructure and education via one of the sub-indexes, which is there on the left-hand side, universal access. And that is one of the 4 sub-indexes that contribute to the Web Index, and that is all based on secondary data on internet penetration, education, statistics, and information about, for example, how you know, education for women in different countries, and so that is sort of that's how the Web Index tries to deal with the fact that really the base level of infrastructure and also education is going to impact on how the internet affects development outcomes. Second country-specific factor is the role of government. Government policy on internet infrastructure and education is going to be hugely important here in terms of how social media impacts on outcomes in the country. The government's policy towards internet censorship and surveillance is also going to be important. And I just mentioned there, sort of, for example, you know, the so-called Great Firewall of China, and there's research by Gary King and colleagues on sort of the composite, or how the firewall operates, what sorts of things get blocked and what things don't get blocked. Also, government's own web presence is going to be very important here, because governments use the internet and increasingly, at least in developed countries, social media in order to deliver services and information to people. So how the government uses the web itself will impact on how the web or social media can contribute to development outcomes. Another point there is work by Helen Margetts at the Oxford Internet Institute on this idea of nodality. So it's how government is positioned within social and informational networks, in order, you know, how central it is, how that that impacts on its ability to effectively dispense information. And then the final thing is that cultures vary across countries, and cultural differences across countries may impact on how social media is likely to impact on development. So one of the things I've been interested in is that there's a huge body of research on by computer science research looking at how there are cultural differences across countries. in terms of social media use. So a lot of the research is looking at Chinese users of Sina Weibo versus US Twitter users, and they're relating this to Hofstede's work on cultural differences, indexes of cultural differences, collectivism versus individualism, sort of the masculinity, power distance indexes. And so they're looking to see how these cultural differences are discernible in social media behaviour. And so what we're arguing here is that to the extent there are cultural differences in social media use, then that will impact on our conclusions about how social media contributes to development outcomes. So for example, a colleague at the ANU, Ariane Utomo, she's done work on how Facebook is being used by women in Jakarta, women who are use Facebook in order to sell goods, handcrafts or things that they've made. So it's like a cottage industry, the use of Facebook for commercial activities, sale of goods and services by women. And so what she argues is that the Indonesians use Facebook in a way that reflects their cultural reality, and she calls it the whole village approach in Facebook. It's reminiscent of the prevailing norms that you invite everyone you know to the wedding, even acquaintances and distant relatives, to avoid offending anyone. And that, she says, is evident in people's use of Facebook. And so that is going to change our understanding it's going to change how Facebook is being used. It's no longer a tool for strong ties. Actually I saw this, we have an Indonesian student who tested some software, a Facebook application that we developed for collecting people's personal networks. And this person had 5,000 friends or 2,000 friends or something, and it broke our software. So, and these were not strong ties, they were weak ties. So it makes our sort of assumptions about how Facebook are being used, it's different depending on the country that's being, and so if there are cultural differences in social media use, then we need to take that into account in terms of understanding how social media can contribute to development outcomes. So I've spoken a bit longer than I intended to, so thank you for your attention, and very happy to have any kind of conversation or discussion or questions. Thank you.
Very good. Susan and Chip had this research on mobile phone use, but I guess that's strong. I kept thinking of your research. They must be really dealing with strong ties over mobile phone, or I don't know. Did you connect to some of the research traditions here?
I mean, we find very similarly that trusted, the whole importance of trusted ties, and the way we are working with that in our latest effort, this is with Tian, who's a PhD student here, Tian, and is that we're applying this approach, a video-based approach, where we rely very heavily on local actors and local members of the community to be the actual people who communicate about innovations.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so instead of it coming,
you work with creating aspirations, but also in new information about new approaches and agricultural practices.
What's the country setting?
We're doing this work is in Kenya right now.
Yep. Okay.
Mostly, and so where we had hoped to use more indirect approaches to communicating this information, either through mobile devices, like Susan and I spent some time looking at market information systems, which didn't seem to be doing much of anything, and through mobile devices, and it's clearly not coming from trusted sources.
Yeah. Okay.
And also, looking at video that was provided by sort of national broadcasting companies, but those didn't seem to have the kind of direct and immediate influence that a video with people where you can clearly tell these are from your local area, and these are people who are like you, and so that's become so we've migrated more to using that approach.
Right. Okay.
Susan has done more work looking at social media
Mhm.
specifically.
Mhm.
So you probably have lots of other insights about how people are using social media.
Well, I'm just curious if you can point to examples where it's really had the social and economic impact in the developed world, and sort of push you to think why you would even think it would have any sort of impact in these countries. Where is that coming?
Oh, where it came from was I got asked to write a paper on social media and development. Yeah, so I just took the approach that I don't have any. I looked for evidence. I was looking for evidence. I couldn't find any.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
that might be the lesson.
Yeah. So instead, what I that aspect of it was more speculative, I guess. It's like, this is the literature on social networks and development more generally. You know, what might we draw from this that could help us to, you know, to get a handle on how social media might impact. But I didn't find any evidence.
And if you even take a step back,
I didn't find any research,
yeah.
actually. It's not the case I didn't find any evidence, but it's like I didn't find any research that was specifically on this topic.
And even if you look at the mobile phone, I mean, there's still debatable what impact, if any, that's had. And, so it might just be interesting to think about it.
Yeah. And I didn't. Mobile phones were not like the part of our remit. Like they because that was being covered elsewhere, I believe, in the report. So it's just like had to be social media. I mean, and that was fine because that's kind of what I've done my work on. But it was challenging to find that sort of relevant literature, I think. Yeah.
But if I could push that a minute. I mean, first of all, like on the political and social movements.
Yeah.
I mean, Twitter and Facebook are borderless in a sense. And so, I mean, for example, when you saw tweets about Ukrainian police shooting protesters in this town square and so forth, this was global.
Yeah.
And so there was both the developed and developing world. I mean, and so social movements depend not just on getting people in the street, but also enrolling people globally in terms of changing the narrative of what's going on here.
You know, you're right, but Hofstede's model doesn't account for any of that. So
No.
I would sort of push that out. I think most people sort of consider that's dated, and I don't see it really working well in this context.
You mean Hofstede?
Yeah, for making sense of cultural
collectivism.
differences. I mean, Bill's point is one of many. I mean, most people have multiple identities. I mean, you can be Kenyan American, and there are differences within countries, vast differences between rural and urban areas that Hofstede's model also doesn't account
But
for.
we have seen several, particularly 2 dimensions from Hofstede classification in the adoption of technology in developed settings. And in developing settings, it's received mixed results. Particularly though, especially as you touched on the last part, being the cultural factors, being that warrant further exploration. In some of the developing, and then the question is, what is developing? And are we talking about, what about the countries that are placed in the middle classification? So for example, in parts of the Middle East or the GCC, Saudi Arabia, where we have a lot of experience with as a unit, as a college, you see that the weak ties are actually presenting more opportunities for access to innovative ideas and technology and other resources, whereas the strong ties, because of the collectivistic nature and the uncertainty avoidance that is typically associated with those groups, they tend to act as bottlenecks, barriers, damping an individual's interest, particularly in entrepreneurial activities and by extension economic development. So those are some subtle points, I think, for the weak tie, strong tie relationship.
Yeah. I think the dichotomy of weak and strong tie is not that useful either. It's useful, but I think we oversimplify things. And like what Tien found in her research in Malawi was that if you're too close, people don't believe that you know anything different than they know.
Yeah.
And so they're like, I see, that, these, this is somebody who's just like me, but, and I actually know what they know, and so I'm not going to believe this stuff that they're telling me. Whereas if it's reasonably close, so that it's somebody who shares, they can, use information and know that they share a lot of kind of similar situations, but they might actually know something different.
Yes.
They're more likely to accept the message. So it's just, I think that there's a lot of nuances there that get glossed over if you say, strong tie, weak tie.
Yeah.
So.
Could I just add, it also depends on what level you, for example, I believe that radio is still the most dominant media for development, but in developing countries, but that the people who are developing the programming for radio are on the web, and they are on social media, and so, I mean, and people in government positions, and people in embassies, and so forth, so that the opinion leaders and opinion shapers in these countries, but if we keep looking at the sort of the general public, yes, radio is, but in terms of influencing radio and influencing policy and influencing the country, then still the web and social media, but it's at a different, it's among the networked individuals in the country, which will be a smaller group, but right, if you look at a traditional, I mean, ever since the sort of, I remember Ev Rogers and others when they started satellites and development, it was always trying to reach people in villages on the TVs in the village, and I guess the dream of the development research is to reach the end.
Yeah, the people whose lives you're trying to
directly
connect with, but it's very complicated.
I just want to follow up to the points Chip made. I think we spend a lot of time just trying to connect people, but we don't really know what to connect with them, and then how actually we connect. We just want to connect, but I don't know what's the point that you connect, but you don't provide them useful content, useful message for their learning or business.
Well, because we don't want it to be top down in terms of the designing it. It's like, anyway, I think there's a belief that if the communication is good.
I mean, there's often this possibility that the connection will lead to a fruitful event at some point. You don't know ex ante when that point might happen, and it may never happen, but you connect in anticipation of that possibility.
Seems provide opportunity for them to have the chance to access better information.
And I'm sure people in this room have had that situation. I certainly have, where I've connected with somebody just for the sake of that possibility, and it led to something maybe 2 years later.
Yeah, I guess it's when these connections are relatively cost-free, then it's not such a problem. But if there's a cost associated with maintaining, then you're basically diverting resources from what you should be doing, or
That's right.
Yeah.
So one of my problems is, I'm sorry for running. I'm Johannes Brauer, so we haven't had a chance to meet. That's all.
Nice to meet you.
And I have to leave in a couple of minutes again.
We have a competing.
But so one of the challenges,
Thank you very much.
Looking forward to
Thank you.
seeing your paper.
Yeah, thanks.
I think is that I think the level of aggregation is actually too high, because you look at least in most cases. I mean, you look at social media. I mean, what are you looking at? Is it social media in enterprise settings? Is it social media in personal settings?
So
that
the brief for this paper was personal settings, not an enterprise.
And so in that setting, of course, they're used for a lot of unproductive tasks. And so currently we are so worried about internet access and productivity. Well, 80% of internet use is actually for entertainment purposes. It will have actually, if anything, a negative impact on productivity. And so that's why people like Robert Gordon claim that the effect of ICT on productivity is actually unnoticeable. And I think he's exaggerating his point somewhat. But I think the problem is that we're aggregating too much, and then the positive and negative effects really sort of probably even each other out, compensate each other.
Especially that gets further complicated when the analyses, the articles, the reports refer to brands, the Facebook brand, the Twitter brand, when in fact each of these brands may have a different number of technology services that they provide. At this point, Facebook is a far more diverse platform than Twitter is. Twitter has a microblogging service that it affords. The affordances that are provided, interpreted, emerge into the user are far more limited than they would be compared to Facebook. And when you look at Facebook profiles versus Facebook pages, probably the two most distinct entities, then it's hard to make those comparisons. Now, if we were to look at the social network site functionality vis-a-vis the profile versus Twitter as a microblog platform, then it starts getting a little bit more comparable.
Mm.
But especially from an organizational perspective, economic activity, you're going to see far different uses and outcomes when you look at pages than profiles.
Okay, thanks for coming, Rob. So why do you say that? Why do you greater outpacks than profiles? I didn't quite get that point.
Because by default, the page is supposed to be representing an organizational entity, as opposed to an individual entity, which is, per the terms of use of Facebook, should be a profile. So if I'm representing the department, my messaging activity will be different on behalf of the page, as opposed to my personal profile. The messaging that happens on behalf of the organizational entity, let's say the department, will far more likely be associated with economic or other outcomes that are of concern here, development and so on. Whereas my profile, it is like to Johan's point in terms of predominantly recreational, leisure, hedonically anchored message exchanges than utility-oriented outcomes that the individual may be considering.
But we just finished an article with looking in Finland at social media sites, as you would. And anyway, but we did a census of all the pages on in Facebook in Finland and tried to categorize the proportion that we had dealt with some kind of social or political movement. And we found like less than 1%. It was like a very small proportion.
And the rest?
Say 40 pages had some impact on a social movement. So, but my argument was
What's the rest? The other 99%?
entertainment. It's it's just
Entertainment
you know,
or
or
for-profit commerce?
all of the above, everything else, and it's all quite. But it's usually entertainment and or.
So, but at that
things that
point,
don't
you're
go
also
anywhere.
taking away the CSR component of any for-profit entity that may be communicated on the social platform.
Maybe.
Like Starbucks, for example, does a great job on Facebook page to communicate their CSR in terms as they enact it, which is by supporting Habitat for Humanity and other projects.
Well, these were well. Anyway, we've got enumerated all of them, and they're generally
The mission at a high level, you're right, it could be far more. It's a minority that would be set to support social or development.
But my point would be, why wouldn't we expect that? In other words, my God, if we got on Facebook every day to start a social movement, or to overthrow the government or anything else, it would be absurd, right? I mean, it's like most people, only about 10% of the public even think about politics in most countries, and certainly in the U.S. And unless Trump is running, so the idea that something that's primarily a social, like the telephone or the Facebook, it's primarily a social media, might occasionally be hijacked for a political purpose or a development purpose and so forth, because you're creating a network which can enable people to communicate about, oh my God, the Flint water crisis or the whatever. Well, that's not the intended purpose, but it can be put to that. All I'm saying is we would expect a small percentage of political, social uses of this, rather than say it's mainly an entertainment media. A small point, but it's hard to get norm what level of expectation should we have about whether a medium is valuable for a particular activity, because I mean, if we looked at face-to-face communication, what proportion of face-to-face communication is used for development purposes? It'd be almost infinitesimal. Yeah. Anyway, but this is great, Rob. Really great. Anyway,
Thank you.
I think you made it through the report, but I can imagine we got beat up occasionally. We had to.
I'll have to talk to you about that off camera, actually.
We survived it, but it was good. They were good. It's good to write for people who read and comment and really push you to put up with sharper findings and things like that. But I thought you gave them a number of theoretical perspectives that they could think about.
Yeah, that's what I hoped in the end. That was like it was just a different way of looking at it that perhaps they weren't going to get otherwise. And yeah, some of it made it into the main report, but yeah, it was definitely intellectually challenging. But that it was good. Yeah.
Okay.